My name is Teresa, and at 29 years old, I was sitting in my tiny Seattle studio apartment when my mother called with news that would shatter everything I believed about my family. She was practically glowing through the video call, announcing that she and my father had just paid off my sister Grace's entire $280,000 medical school debt. Meanwhile, my $85,000 in engineering loans from MIT sat untouched, growing interest every single day. Before I share what happened next, where are you watching from? If you've ever felt overlooked by your own family, please hit that like button and subscribe, because this story might just give you the courage to stand up for yourself too. Growing up in suburban Massachusetts, I thought we were just a normal middle-class family trying to make it work. My father worked as an accountant for a local firm, putting in 12-hour days during tax season, while my mother worked as a nurse at the community hospital, often pulling double shifts to make ends meet. Our house was modest, a three-bedroom colonial with peeling paint and a garage door that only opened if you hit it just right. But it was home, and for the first 2 years of my life, I was the center of my parents' universe. Everything changed when Grace arrived. My mother had suffered 3 miscarriages between my birth and Grace's each loss, sending her into deeper periods of grief that filled our house with a heavy silence. I was too young to understand why Mommy spent so many days in bed, or why Daddy's eyes were always red. But I remember the hushed conversations, and the way they looked at me sometimes like I was both a blessing and a painful reminder of what they kept losing. When Grace finally arrived healthy and screaming at the top of her lungs, the doctors called her a miracle baby, and from that moment forward, she was treated like one. I noticed the differences in small ways at first. While I got hand-me-down clothes from cousins, Grace's closet filled with brand new outfits from Baby Gap and Janie and Jack. My toys came from garage sales and thrift stores, carefully cleaned and presented as special finds. But Grace's nursery looked like a Pottery Barn kids catalog had exploded in it. My mother would spend hours just watching Grace sleep, tears streaming down her face as she whispered prayers of gratitude. I learned to play quietly by myself, understanding even at 4 years old that Grace needed Mommy more than I did. School became my escape and my salvation. I discovered I had a natural aptitude for mathematics and science, devouring books about space and computers, while other kids my age were still learning basic addition. At 12, I taught myself to code using an ancient desktop computer. I found at a yard sale, spending entire weekends debugging programs and creating simple games. My parents acknowledged my achievements with distracted pats on the head and comments like, "That's nice, honey," before turning their attention back to Grace's dance recital or piano lesson, or whatever activity she was enrolled in that week. The favoritism became impossible to ignore during high school. When I earned a 50% scholarship to MIT through academic merit and countless hours of studying, my parents' response was lukewarm at best. My mother said it was wonderful while scrolling through her phone, and my father asked if I was sure I wanted to go somewhere so far from home. 2 years later, when Grace got accepted to Harvard Medical School, they threw a party that rivaled most wedding receptions. 100 guests filled our backyard, champagne flowed despite the expense, and my mother gave a tearful speech about how proud she was of her baby girl following her dreams. For my 16th birthday, I got a cake from the grocery store and dinner at Applebee's with just the family. Grace's 16th birthday featured a professionally catered affair, a DJ, and a brand new Honda Civic sitting in the driveway with a giant red bow. When I asked why the difference, my mother pulled me aside and explained that Grace was more sensitive, more fragile, and needed more support to thrive. I was strong, independent, capable of taking care of myself. At the time, I accepted this explanation, even felt proud that my parents saw me as so capable, not realizing they were really just telling me I was on my own. College highlighted the disparity even more starkly. I worked 3 jobs to cover what my scholarship didn't, serving coffee at a campus cafe from 5 to 9 in the morning, tutoring struggling students in the afternoon, and coding freelance projects late into the night. My meals consisted of ramen noodles and peanut butter sandwiches, and I wore the same 5 outfits in rotation for 4 years. Meanwhile, Grace lived in a luxury apartment near Harvard Square, her rent and utilities fully covered by our parents. She had a meal plan, a clothing allowance, and spending money for weekend trips to New York or skiing in Vermont. When I mentioned the inequality to my mother, she said medical school was so stressful and demanding that Grace couldn't possibly work while studying. My graduation from MIT should have been a moment of triumph. I had maintained a 3.9 GPA while working multiple jobs, had already secured a position at Microsoft with a six-figure starting salary, and was graduating debt-free except for the loans I'd taken out. But my parents arrived an hour late to the ceremony because Grace had an important anatomy exam that morning and needed moral support. They sat in the back, left immediately after I walked across the stage, and the celebration dinner was cut short because Grace had study group that evening. I smiled through it all, the responsible older sister who understood priorities. Grace's medical school graduation 2 years later was a completely different story. My parents flew the entire extended family to Boston, renting a block of hotel rooms and organizing a week of celebrations. There were brunches and dinners, a boat cruise in the harbor, and endless photos of Grace in her cap and gown. I had to use vacation days to attend, and when I mentioned a huge project deadline I was facing, my mother accused me of trying to steal Grace's spotlight. That night alone in my hotel room while the family continued celebrating downstairs, I finally admitted to myself what I'd known all along, but had been too afraid to face. I wasn't just less loved, I was barely seen at all. The call came on a Friday evening after I just finished a 12-hour sprint debugging code for a critical product launch. I was exhausted, sitting on my secondhand couch eating takeout Thai food straight from the container, when my phone lit up with my mother's face. She was practically vibrating with excitement, her smile so wide it looked painful. And I knew immediately that something big had happened with Grace. It always involved Grace when she looked that happy. My father appeared in the frame, his arm around my mother's shoulders, both of them looking like they'd won the lottery. In a way, I suppose they felt they had. Grace had just accepted a position at Massachusetts General Hospital, one of the most prestigious hospitals in the country, and they wanted to share the wonderful news with me. I forced enthusiasm into my voice, congratulating my sister on her achievement, genuinely happy for her, despite the familiar ache of being the audience to her success, rather than a celebrated participant in my own. Then my mother dropped the bomb that would change everything. She clasped her hands together like she was about to pray, and announced with tears in her eyes that they had decided to pay off all of Grace's medical school loans as a graduation gift. $280,000 gone with the stroke of a pen, so their baby girl could start her career without the burden of debt. The number hit me like a physical blow, knocking the breath from my lungs as I thought about my own loans accumulating interest every month while I scraped and saved and lived on rice and beans to make extra payments. The words escaped before I could stop them tumbling out, in a voice that sounded small and broken even to my own ears. I asked what about my loans, the $85,000 that still haunted my bank statements and credit reports. The silence that followed stretched between us like a chasm. My mother's smile faltering as she looked away from the camera, suddenly fascinated by something off-screen. My father cleared his throat, that nervous sound he made when he had to deliver bad news to clients, and I knew what was coming before he even opened his mouth. He explained in that measured, reasonable tone he used when he thought he was being logical that my situation was different. I worked in tech after all, where salaries were famously high, and stock options could make you rich overnight. Grace was entering medicine, a noble profession dedicated to saving lives, and the financial burden of medical school was so much greater than what I had taken on for my engineering degree. Besides, I had always been so good with money, so responsible and independent. Surely I understood that Grace needed this support more than I did. My mother jumped in, then her voice taking on that defensive edge it got whenever she felt guilty, but didn't want to admit it. She reminded me that family supports each other, that we all have to make sacrifices for the greater good, and that jealousy was an ugly emotion that didn't belong between sisters. The irony of her talking about family support while actively denying me any nearly made me laugh, but the sound that came out was closer to a sob. I asked them point blank if they had ever once considered helping me with my loans, even a small amount, even just the interest. Another silence, heavier this time, before my mother sighed like I was being unreasonable. They had assumed I had everything under control, she said, because I never asked for help. I never complained, never seemed to struggle. Always figured things out on my own. It had never occurred to them that maybe I didn't ask, because I knew what the answer would be that I'd learned from years of experience, that Grace's needs would always come first, and mine would always come last, if they came at all. Grace chose that moment to bounce into frame radiant in designer scrubs that probably cost more than my entire wardrobe, throwing her arms around our parents and gushing about how grateful she was for their generosity. She looked at me through the screen with that practiced innocence she'd perfected over the years, the one that said she had no idea why I might be upset, and thanked me for being such a supportive big sister. The rage that filled me in that moment was so pure, so crystalline, that it felt like ice in my veins. I couldn't speak, couldn't breathe, could only stare at the three of them huddled together in their perfect family unit, while I sat alone in my apartment, the outsider looking in. My mother must have sensed the storm building, because she quickly tried to smooth things over, suggesting we all get together for dinner soon to celebrate Grace's new job properly. When I didn't respond, she frowned and delivered the final blow, the words that would echo in my head for days afterward. She told me I had always been jealous of my sister, that it was unbecoming, and something I should have outgrown by now. Before I could respond, before I could defend myself or point out the absurdity of her accusation, I ended the call. The silence that followed was deafening. I didn't sleep that night, couldn't even cry, just sat in the darkness of my apartment, replaying every moment of favoritism I'd witnessed over the years. The birthday parties I'd planned for myself because my parents were too busy with Grace's activities. The parent-teacher conferences they missed because Grace had a recital or a game, or just needed help with homework. The Christmas morning when I was 17 and Grace got a MacBook Pro while I got a $50 gift card to Target. Every memory felt like another cut death by 1,000 small wounds that had finally added up to something fatal. The next morning, I made a decision that would change everything. I scrolled through my contacts until I found the number I needed, my finger hovering over it as I gathered my courage. My grandmother, Margaret. My mother's mother had always been different from the rest of the family. Where they saw Grace as delicate and me as invincible, she saw two granddaughters who deserved equal love and attention. She'd built a restaurant empire from nothing, turning a single diner into a chain of 15 successful establishments across New England. And she'd done it all while raising 3 kids as a single mother after my grandfather died young. My grandmother Margaret was the kind of woman who commanded attention without demanding it, who could silence a room with a raised eyebrow and close million-dollar deals over afternoon tea. She'd started with nothing but a $5,000 life insurance payout after my grandfather's death, and built it into a $30 million restaurant empire through sheer determination and business acumen that would put most MBAs to shame. While my mother had inherited her looks, she'd somehow missed out on the steel spine and sharp mind that made Margaret a force of nature in Boston's competitive culinary scene. I'd spent summers working in her restaurants as a teenager, not because my parents made me, but because I wanted to learn from her. She taught me about profit margins while I prepped vegetables, explained supply chain management, while we reviewed vendor contracts, and showed me how to read people's true intentions by watching their eyes when they talked about money. Unlike my parents, she never treated me like I was too independent to need guidance or too capable to deserve support. She simply treated me like someone worth investing in. The relationship between Margaret and my mother had always been complicated. My mother resented what she saw as Margaret's coldness, her focus on business over family, her refusal to play the traditional grandmother role of cookies and cuddles. But I saw something different. I saw a woman who'd been told her whole life that she couldn't do things because she was female, poor, uneducated, widowed, and had refused to accept those limitations. She didn't coddle because she knew the world wouldn't, and she believed in preparing the people she loved for reality, rather than protecting them from it. Margaret lived in a sprawling estate in Cape Cod that she'd bought cash after her 10th restaurant opened. The house was her sanctuary, decorated with art from local artists she supported and furnished with pieces that told the story of her journey from poverty to prosperity. She spent winters in Florida, but always returned to the Cape for spring and summer, saying the salt air kept her sharp. At 78, she still went to the office 3 days a week, reviewed every financial report personally, and knew the name of every manager in her employ. Sunday morning was her sacred time, reserved for reading the New York Times cover to cover, and having long phone calls with the few people she considered worth her time. I knew I was interrupting this ritual when I called, but I also knew she'd answer. She always did for me. When her face appeared on my screen, silver hair perfectly coiffed, despite the early hours' sharp blue eyes already assessing my puffy face and red eyes, I felt the first crack in the dam I'd built around my emotions. She listened without interrupting, as I told her everything from the phone call that had started it all to the sleepless night that followed. I showed her the spreadsheet I'd created at 3 in the morning, documenting every instance of financial disparity between Grace and me over the years. The numbers were staggering when laid out in black and white, a clear pattern of favoritism that couldn't be explained away as coincidence or necessity. By the time I finished, my grandmother's expression had shifted from concern to something harder, more dangerous. The silence stretched between us for a long moment before she spoke, her voice carrying that particular tone that had made grown men cry in boardrooms. She asked me if I knew where my parents had gotten the money to pay off Grace's loans, since she knew for a fact their savings had been depleted by Grace's undergraduate education, and they'd been complaining about money just last month. I admitted I hadn't thought to ask, too shocked by the betrayal to question the logistics. Margaret's laugh was bitter and sharp. She informed me that 6 months ago, my parents had come to her in tears, claiming they were facing foreclosure because my father had made some bad investments, and they'd been using their mortgage payments to keep Grace afloat in medical school. Out of family loyalty and concern for their well-being, she'd loaned them $300,000 with specific conditions. The money was to be used for emergency expenses, only medical bills, or to be divided equally between Grace and me if used for education. They'd signed a legal agreement, notarized, and witnessed promising to abide by these terms. The revelation hit me like a thunderbolt. They'd used my grandmother's money meant partially for me to pay off Grace's debt, while telling me to figure it out on my own. It wasn't just favoritism anymore. It was theft. Margaret saw the realization dawn on my face and nodded grimly. She told me to prepare my resignation letter from Microsoft and to start looking for apartments in Boston. When I asked why, confusion mixing with the anger still coursing through me, she smiled for the first time since our call began. She was done watching my parents waste my potential, she said. She needed someone to modernize her restaurants, to bring them into the digital age with online ordering systems, reservation platforms, and social media strategies. Someone who understood both technology and the family business, who could bridge the gap between tradition and innovation. The position of Chief Technology Officer had been vacant for 2 years because she hadn't found anyone she trusted enough to fill it. The salary would be double what I was making at Microsoft, plus equity in the company, and a seat on the board of directors. Before I could respond, she told me she would handle my parents and the situation with the loan. I was to do nothing except wait for her signal and trust that she would make things right. The call ended with her telling me to get some sleep because I looked terrible, which somehow made me laugh through my tears. It was the first time I'd laughed in days, and it felt like breathing again after being underwater too long. Monday morning arrived with a series of increasingly frantic texts from my mother. My grandmother had apparently called their house at 7 sharp, demanding a meeting with her lawyer present and threatening legal action if they didn't comply. My father tried calling me 6 times before 9, leaving voicemails that progressed from confused to angry to pleading. Grace sent a single text asking what I had done, as if I was the villain in the story, rather than the victim finally fighting back. The storm that descended on my family that Monday morning was the kind that would be talked about at family gatherings for generations, whispered about in corners when they thought no one was listening. Margaret had moved with the swift precision of someone who'd orchestrated hostile takeovers and union negotiations, her lawyers arriving at my parents' house before 8, with a briefcase full of documents and expressions that could freeze blood. My mother called me in hysterics, demanding to know what I'd told my grandmother, her voice shrill with panic as she realized the carefully constructed world where Grace was the golden child and I was the afterthought was about to come crashing down. My father, always the numbers man, had tried to argue the technicalities of the loan agreement, claiming that paying for Grace's education counted as a medical emergency, since student loan debt could cause severe psychological distress. Margaret's lawyer, a shark in Armani, who'd handled her business affairs for 20 years, dismantled his argument in less than 5 minutes, pointing out that Grace was already employed and the loans were not in default, therefore no emergency existed. The agreement had been violated, and the full amount was due within 30 days, or legal proceedings would begin. Grace, for her part, seemed genuinely shocked by the revelation that the money used to free her from debt had conditions attached. She called me that afternoon, her voice wavering between anger and confusion, insisting she'd had no idea about the loan from grandmother or its terms. When I asked if she'd ever questioned where our parents, who'd been crying poverty just months before, had suddenly found nearly $300,000, she fell silent. The truth was, she hadn't wanted to know, had been so relieved to have the burden lifted, that she'd never stopped to consider whose shoulders it might fall on instead. The family group chat exploded with messages as news of the situation spread through our extended relatives. Aunts and uncles who'd always praised my parents for their devotion to Grace suddenly had questions about why I'd been excluded from that devotion. Cousins who'd attended Grace's lavish graduation parties while I celebrated alone started reaching out admitting they'd noticed the disparity but hadn't wanted to cause drama. The narrative my parents had carefully crafted over the years that I was too independent to need help, while Grace was too fragile to survive without it, began to unravel thread by thread. Tuesday brought a new development when Margaret announced she was calling a family meeting for Saturday attendance mandatory for anyone who wanted to remain in her good graces, and more importantly, in her will. The power dynamics shifted instantly. My parents, who'd always positioned themselves as the reasonable ones, the stable couple everyone else should emulate, suddenly found themselves in the position of defendants in a trial they couldn't win. The extended family smelled blood in the water, and old resentments about perceived favoritism in other areas began surfacing. My mother tried damage control, calling various relatives with her version of events, painting me as vindictive and jealous, someone who couldn't stand to see her sister succeed. But Margaret had receipts literally, and she wasn't afraid to share them. She sent the entire family copies of the loan agreement, the bank statements showing the money transfer, and most damningly, a spreadsheet similar to the one I'd created documenting every dollar spent on each grandchild over the past decade. The numbers were impossible to dispute and impossible to justify. Wednesday evening, my grandmother called me with an update and a proposition. She'd been thinking about succession planning for her restaurant empire, she said, and recent events had clarified things for her. My mother, despite being the oldest daughter, had shown she couldn't be trusted with financial decisions or fair distribution of resources. My Aunt Patricia lived in California and had no interest in the business. My Uncle James was a perpetual dreamer with no head for numbers. That left the grandchildren, and of the five of us, I was the only one with both the education and the work ethic to handle the responsibility. She wanted me to not just modernize the restaurants, but to prepare to take over the entire operation within 5 years. This meant learning every aspect of the business, from supply chain management to real estate negotiations, from hiring practices to franchise agreements. The CTO position was just the beginning, a testing ground to see if I had what it took to carry on her legacy. The weight of this offer, the trust it represented, was staggering. For the first time in my life, someone was choosing me first, seeing my worth, not in comparison to Grace, but on my own merits. Thursday morning, I submitted my resignation to Microsoft, giving them the standard 2 weeks notice despite wanting to leave immediately. My manager was shocked, trying to counter with promises of promotions and stock options, but my mind was made up. That afternoon, I started looking for apartments in Boston's Back Bay, close enough to the restaurant headquarters to walk but far enough from my parents' house to maintain boundaries. The prices were steep, but with my new salary, I could afford something nice for the first time in my life. Grace texted me that evening, a long message about how unfair this all was to her, how she'd worked so hard in medical school and didn't deserve to have her gift tainted by controversy. I read it 3 times, looking for any acknowledgement of the unfairness I'd endured, any recognition that I too had worked hard and deserved support. Finding none, I deleted the message without responding. Some bridges, I was learning, were meant to burn. Friday afternoon, my parents made their last-ditch effort to avoid the family meeting disaster they saw coming. They offered to pay off my loans immediately if I would call off grandmother and tell everyone this had been a misunderstanding. The desperation in my mother's voice was palpable as she promised they'd be fair from now on, that they'd realized their mistake and wanted to make it right. But I'd heard promises from them before, usually right before they broke them for Grace's benefit. I told them I'd see them at the meeting and hung up. That night alone in my Seattle apartment for one of the last times I finally let myself feel the full weight of what was happening. My family, as I'd known it was ending, but maybe that was okay. Maybe it had never really been my family at all, just a group of people I was related to, who'd never quite seen me as worthy of their full love and attention. Tomorrow would bring confrontation, and probably tears, accusations, and justifications. But it would also bring truth. And after 29 years of accepting crumbs while Grace got the whole cake, I was ready for truth. The meeting took place at my grandmother's Cape Cod estate on a gray Saturday morning that matched the mood perfectly. The dining room table, which could seat 20, was set with Margaret's best china and crystal, a power move that everyone recognized. She sat at the head like a queen holding court, her lawyer at her right hand, and an empty chair at her left that she indicated was mine. The message was clear before anyone even spoke. I was under her protection now, and anyone who came for me would have to go through her. My parents arrived looking haggard, my mother's usually perfect makeup unable to hide the bags under her eyes. My father's shoulders slumped in defeat. Grace came separately, walking in with her chin high, but her hands shaking as she clutched her designer purse. The aunts, uncles, and cousins filled in the remaining seats, everyone avoiding eye contact with each other, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. This wasn't just about money anymore. This was about family mythology being shattered and rebuilt in real time. Margaret opened the meeting by having her lawyer read the original loan agreement in its entirety, every clause and condition spelled out in language that left no room for interpretation. The money was to be used for emergencies only, or if for education, divided equally between the grandchildren. By using the entire amount for Grace alone, my parents had not only violated the legal agreement, but had stolen from me their other daughter. The word theft hung in the air like a poison cloud, making my mother flinch, and my father's face turn red. Then Margaret did something unexpected. She had prepared a presentation complete with slides projected on the wall showing the financial history of our family over the past 20 years. Every birthday, every graduation, every celebration was documented with receipts and bank records. Grace's Sweet 16 party had cost $8,000. Mine had cost $300. Grace's college apartment had cost $36,000 over 4 years. I'd lived in a dorm room the size of a closet. The numbers went on, each one a slap in the face to my parents' claim that they'd treated us equally. When the final slide showed the total amount spent on each daughter, the room gasped collectively. Over the course of our lives, my parents had spent $423,000 on Grace, compared to $38,000 on me. The disparity was so stark, so undeniable, that even Grace's face went pale. She turned to our parents, her voice small and confused, asking if these numbers were real. My mother started crying, my father stared at the table, and their silence was answer enough. Margaret then turned to Grace directly, her voice gentle but firm. She asked Grace if she'd ever wondered why I worked 3 jobs in college while she lived comfortably. If she'd ever questioned why I wore the same clothes for years, while her closet overflowed with new purchases. If it had ever occurred to her that love and resources were being distributed unequally in our family. Grace's composure finally cracked tears, streaming down her face, as she admitted she'd assumed I preferred to be independent, that I didn't want or need help. The extended family began to speak up, then sharing their own observations over the years. My Aunt Patricia mentioned how she'd offered to help me with textbooks once, only to have my mother insist I was fine, while asking her to contribute to Grace's study abroad program instead. My cousin Michael recalled graduation parties where I wasn't even mentioned while Grace was celebrated. Uncle James admitted he'd always wondered why I was never included in the family vacation photos, only to learn I'd been working to pay for summer courses, while everyone else went to Disney World. My mother tried to defend herself, claiming she'd done her best, that Grace had needed more support because she was sensitive and struggled with anxiety. But Margaret cut her off with a raised hand, pointing out that perhaps I had struggled too, but nobody had bothered to notice because they were too focused on Grace. The trauma of being invisible in your own family, she said, was just as damaging as any anxiety disorder, maybe more so because it went completely untreated and unacknowledged. Then came the ultimatum. My parents had two choices. They could either pay back the full $300,000 within 30 days, which would likely mean selling their house and liquidating their retirement accounts, or they could sign a new agreement promising to pay off my student loans immediately, using whatever resources necessary, and commit to equal treatment of both daughters, going forward with Margaret monitoring compliance. Additionally, Grace would need to take responsibility for her own loans, getting them reinstated, and managing them herself like any other adult with a medical degree and a six-figure salary. The room erupted in arguments, then my father trying to negotiate, my mother sobbing about betrayal, Grace insisting this wasn't her fault. But Margaret remained calm, unmoved by the chaos. She announced that she was also restructuring her will effective immediately. The restaurant empire that everyone had assumed would be divided among her children would now skip a generation. I would receive 50% with the remaining 50% divided among the other grandchildren, including Grace. My mother would receive nothing beyond what she'd already been given in life. The meeting ended with my parents agreeing to the second option, signing papers with shaking hands, while my mother refused to look at me. Grace approached me afterward, mascara streaking down her cheeks, saying she was sorry that she honestly hadn't realized how bad it had been for me. I wanted to be angry at her to reject her apology, but I saw something in her eyes I'd never seen before. Genuine recognition of what she'd been given and what it had cost me. It wasn't enough to heal the wounds, but it was a start. The aftermath of the family meeting rippled through our lives like an earthquake, followed by countless aftershocks. My parents signed the new agreement with Margaret's lawyer, standing over them, committing to pay off my $85,000 in student loans within 90 days. They had to liquidate their vacation fund, sell my mother's SUV, and cash out a portion of my father's 401k, each financial sacrifice accompanied by bitter complaints about unfairness and ingratitude. The irony of them calling the situation unfair wasn't lost on anyone, especially not on me, as I watched them struggle with the same financial stress I'd been dealing with alone for years. Grace had to face the harsh reality of reinstating her loans, a process that proved more complicated and expensive than simply having them paid off. The loan servicer charged hefty reinstatement fees, and the interest rate was higher than before. She went from celebrating her debt-free status to facing a $3,000 monthly payment that would follow her for the next 10 years. The first time she called me crying about how overwhelming it was, I had to physically bite my tongue to keep from pointing out that I'd been dealing with similar payments since graduation, while watching her live carefree. 2 weeks after the meeting, I packed up my life in Seattle into a small moving truck and drove across the country to Boston. The apartment I'd found was a far cry from my cramped studio, a one-bedroom with exposed brick walls, hardwood floors, and a view of the Charles River. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't choosing housing based solely on what I could afford, but on what I actually wanted. The freedom of that choice, of not having to sacrifice and scrimp and settle, was intoxicating. My first day as CTO of Margaret's restaurant empire was overwhelming in the best possible way. The headquarters occupied the top 3 floors of a building in Boston's financial district, with floor-to-ceiling windows and a conference room that could seat 30. My office, larger than my entire Seattle apartment had been, came with an assistant, a technology team of 12, and a budget that made my Microsoft projects look like pocket change. Margaret introduced me to the board as her successor in training, making it clear that anyone who had a problem with me had a problem with her. The work itself was challenging, but exhilarating. The restaurant industry was decades behind in technology adoption, and Margaret's establishments, while successful, were operating on systems that belonged in a museum. I implemented new POS systems that could track inventory in real time, developed a mobile app that increased takeout orders by 40% in the first month, and created a data analytics platform that helped managers optimize staffing and reduce waste. Every success felt like vindication proof that I'd always been capable of greatness if someone had just given me the chance. Meanwhile, my relationship with my parents deteriorated to the point of near non-existence. My mother refused to speak to me for 3 months, communicating only through terse text messages when absolutely necessary. When she finally called, it was to inform me that I was no longer welcome at Sunday dinners, that my betrayal of the family had consequences. I laughed, actually laughed at the idea that excluding me from family gatherings was supposed to be punishment when I'd been excluded my whole life anyway. My father tried to maintain some relationship calling occasionally to discuss safe topics like the weather or Boston sports, but even those conversations were strained. He mentioned once that they'd had to cancel their anniversary trip to Italy to afford my loan payment, clearly expecting sympathy or guilt. When I responded that I'd never been on a family vacation because I was always working to pay for school, he hung up and didn't call again for 6 weeks. The surprise came from Grace, who began reaching out regularly, not for help or money, but just to talk. She was struggling with the reality of loan payments, 12-hour shifts, and the pressure of her new position without the safety net she'd always taken for granted. For the first time in our lives, she was experiencing what I'd lived with for years, and it was humbling her in ways our parents' favoritism never could have. She admitted during one late-night call that she'd been living in a bubble oblivious to how much she'd been given and how much I'd been denied. We started meeting for coffee once a month, awkward encounters at first where we struggled to find common ground beyond our shared genetics. But gradually, as she shared her struggles and I shared my successes, we began building something that resembled an actual relationship. She asked questions about my work, genuinely interested in the technology I was implementing and the challenges I was overcoming. I found myself offering advice about managing finances and dealing with workplace stress, things she'd never had to learn before. Margaret became more than just my grandmother and boss. She became my mentor and closest confidant. We had dinner together every Thursday sometimes at one of her restaurants, where she'd quiz me about operations and efficiency. Sometimes at her house, where we'd drink wine and she'd tell me stories about building her empire, when nobody believed a widow with 3 kids could succeed in business. She taught me about negotiation, about reading people, about when to be ruthless and when to show mercy. Every lesson was delivered with the understanding that I was being groomed to take over, that this knowledge was my inheritance. The financial freedom that came with my new position allowed me to do things I'd only dreamed of before. I joined a gym that wasn't in a basement, bought clothes that weren't on clearance, ate at restaurants without checking prices first. But more importantly, I started therapy to deal with the years of emotional neglect and the guilt I still carried for disrupting the family. My therapist, a no-nonsense woman who specialized in family trauma, helped me understand that asking for equality wasn't betrayal, that standing up for yourself wasn't selfishness. 6 months into my new role, the company's profits had increased by 15%, largely due to the efficiencies I'd introduced. Margaret announced at the board meeting that she was promoting me to President of Operations, in addition to my CTO duties, effectively making me second in command of the entire company. The pride in her eyes when she made the announcement was something I'd never seen from my parents. Not when I got into MIT, not when I graduated with honors, not when I landed my job at Microsoft. It was pure, uncomplicated pride in who I was and what I'd accomplished. A full year had passed since that fateful phone call in my Seattle studio, and as I stood in my corner office overlooking Boston Harbor, I could barely recognize the person I used to be. The woman who accepted scraps and called them enough, who worked 3 jobs while watching her sister live in luxury, who smiled through family dinners, where her achievements were footnotes to Grace's headlines, felt like a stranger from another lifetime. The Teresa looking back at me from the window's reflection wore designer clothes that fit perfectly, stood with shoulders back instead of hunched in apology, and had eyes that no longer sought approval, but commanded respect. The transformation wasn't just external. Under my leadership, Margaret's restaurant empire had undergone a digital revolution that increased profits by 40% and cut operational costs by a quarter. We'd launched a meal kit service that competed with national brands, developed an AI-driven inventory system that virtually eliminated waste, and created a loyalty program that had increased customer retention by 60%. Every board member who'd initially questioned my appointment now sang my praises, and several competitors had tried to poach me with offers that would have seemed impossible just 18 months ago. Grace had completed her first year as an attending physician, and the experience had changed her profoundly. Living on a resident's salary while managing loan payments had taught her the value of money in a way our parents' generosity never could have. She'd moved from her luxury apartment to a modest two-bedroom she shared with another doctor, learned to cook instead of ordering takeout every night, and started shopping at Target instead of Nordstrom. During our monthly coffee meetings, she'd sometimes laugh about how she used to think I was choosing to live, simply not realizing I had no choice at all. Our relationship had evolved into something I never thought possible, an actual friendship built on mutual respect rather than obligation. She'd call me for advice about investing her small savings, and I'd help her understand compound interest and index funds, things she'd never needed to learn when mom and dad handled everything. In return, she offered something I'd never had before: genuine acknowledgement of my accomplishments and the unfairness I'd endured. When she publicly toasted me at her birthday dinner, calling me the strongest person she knew, and apologizing for taking so long to see it, I had to excuse myself to the bathroom to cry. My parents and I had reached a detente of sorts, a careful peace maintained through minimal contact and careful boundaries. They'd finished paying off my student loans, the final payment made with a certified check delivered by courier rather than in person. My mother had sent a card with it, a generic congratulations message with no personal note, but it was progress from the complete silence of earlier months. They'd even invited me to Thanksgiving, though I declined, choosing instead to host my first holiday dinner in my new apartment with Margaret and a few friends who'd become my chosen family. The real vindication came when Forbes did a feature on innovative women in the restaurant industry, highlighting my work modernizing Margaret's empire. The article praised my unique combination of technical expertise and business acumen, calling me the future of food service technology. My parents, according to Grace, had bought multiple copies and showed them to anyone who would listen, claiming they'd always known I'd be successful. The revisionist history might have angered me once, but now it just seems sad, this desperate attempt to claim credit for success they'd actively hindered. Margaret's health had begun to decline slightly. Nothing serious, but enough to remind us both that our time together was limited. She'd started transferring more responsibilities to me, introducing me to long-term vendors as her successor, including me in real estate negotiations, having me represent the company at industry events. At the last Restaurant Association gala, she'd introduced me simply as the future of her company, her legacy, the granddaughter who'd inherited not just her business, but her spirit. During one of our Thursday dinners, she told me something that finally helped me understand my mother's behavior. Margaret had been the same way with her children, so focused on business that she'd often neglected emotional needs, missing recitals and games for meetings and contracts. My mother had probably given Grace everything she'd wished she'd received herself, not realizing she was repeating the pattern with me, just in reverse. It didn't excuse it, but it explained it, and understanding brought a kind of peace I hadn't expected. The relationship between Margaret and my mother had improved slightly after Margaret saw how my mother had tried to make amends, however awkwardly. They'd had lunch together for the first time in 2 years, and while my mother had reportedly cried through most of it, she'd also finally acknowledged that her favoritism had damaged both her daughter's Grace by making her dependent, and me by making me invisible. Margaret had told her that recognition was the first step toward redemption, though whether my mother would take the other steps remained to be seen. I'd started dating someone, a software engineer named Daniel, who understood long hours and family complications because he had plenty of both himself. He'd met me at my strongest, never knowing the girl who accepted less than she deserved, and sometimes I worried he wouldn't understand that part of my history. But when I finally told him the whole story over dinner one night, he'd reached across the table to take my hand and said that my journey from invisible to undeniable was what he admired most about me. The success I'd achieved professionally had given me the confidence to set boundaries personally. I no longer jumped to answer every family text, no longer rearranged my schedule to accommodate others' needs, no longer apologized for taking up space in the world. When distant relatives reached out asking for loans or jobs, assuming my new position meant I'd be an easy mark, I had no problem saying no. The girl who'd once been grateful for any attention was gone, replaced by a woman who knew her worth and refused to accept less. One evening, while reviewing expansion plans for 3 new restaurant locations, I realized that the secret to my success wasn't just the opportunity Margaret had given me, but the years of struggle that had prepared me for it. Every double shift I'd worked, every meal I'd skipped to save money every night, I'd coded until dawn, had built the resilience and determination that made me unstoppable once the playing field was leveled. Grace, for all her intelligence and medical training, had never developed those muscles, and watching her struggle now with what I'd managed for years proved that favoritism ultimately weakens both the favored and the overlooked. The anniversary of the family meeting arrived with little fanfare, just another Saturday in April, but I marked it privately as my Independence Day. That was the day I'd stopped accepting inequality, stopped making excuses for people who should have loved me better, stopped believing that being family meant accepting unfairness. Margaret had called that morning to remind me that standing up for yourself isn't betrayal, it's survival, and that sometimes the only way to save a family is to break it first so it can heal properly. As I looked out at Boston spreading below me, lights beginning to twinkle in the dusk, I thought about that girl in the Seattle studio crying over her parents' favoritism and wished I could tell her what was coming, that the pain would transform into power, that the rejection would become redirection, that the family who'd overlooked her would be replaced by people who saw her clearly. But maybe she needed to go through it all, needed to hit bottom before she could rise, needed to lose everything she thought mattered to find what actually did. The call I'd made to Margaret that morning a year ago had changed everything, but not in the way I'd expected. I thought I was just exposing unfairness, seeking some small measure of justice for years of inequality. Instead, I'd started a revolution that toppled the family hierarchy, redistributed power and wealth, and most importantly, showed me that I'd never needed my parents' approval to be worthy. I'd always been enough. I'd just been surrounded by people who couldn't see it. My phone buzzed with a text from Grace, a photo from her apartment where she was hosting her first dinner party, proud of the simple meal she'd prepared herself. She'd added a message saying she finally understood why I'd always seemed so satisfied with small accomplishments. Because when you work for everything yourself, even the smallest victory feels enormous. I smiled and responded with a photo from my office where I was working late again, but this time by choice rather than necessity. Margaret had been right when she told me that sometimes the family that chooses you is more real than the one you're born into. She'd chosen to see my worth when my parents couldn't chosen to invest in my future, when they'd invested everything in Grace, chosen to believe in my capabilities, when they'd believed I didn't need help. That choice had saved me, but more importantly, it had shown me that I was worth saving. The intercom buzzed with the security guard letting me know Daniel had arrived to pick me up for our late dinner reservation. As I gathered my things, I caught one last glimpse of myself in the window and liked what I saw. A successful woman who'd earned every bit of her achievement, who'd turned rejection into motivation, who discovered that the best revenge against being overlooked isn't making them see you, but becoming so bright they can't look away. If you've made it this far in my story, I want to know, what would you have done in my situation? Would you have made that call to your grandmother or continued accepting the inequality? Drop a comment below sharing your thoughts. And if this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about overcoming family challenges and finding your worth. Share this with anyone who needs to hear that standing up for yourself isn't selfish, it's necessary. Thank you for listening to my journey, and remember, you deserve to be seen, valued, and supported just as much as anyone else in your family.